We just welcome you again. It's great that we can come together just to study the Word of God. And we welcome you, as we've said. We want to pray that this message will be a blessing to you. We're looking at Elijah at the moment, just considering the prophet. So many precious passages in 1 Kings about him, and even going into 2 Kings, the early chapters. So much to learn from this man. Things that can challenge us, things that can also warn us, because sometimes we can lose out with God. And we're going to see today that in one way Elijah did lose out with God. In spite of all that God was able to do through him, the moment came whenever he was no longer used as once he was. So Elijah, the prophet, is our subject. We've looked at Elijah before the king. Remember when he went in to challenge the king? First of all, Ahab, and to tell him there'd be no rain. And then we saw him by the brook when he went to hide by the brook Cherith, and the ravens fed him there by the brook. Then we saw Elijah was with the widow of Zarephath, and she put God first in her life and fed him, and God provided for her and her son until the famine and the rains. The famine ended and the rains came. Elijah before the king, Elijah by the brook, Elijah with the widow. And then we saw Elijah on the mount, that moment when he challenged the prophets of Baal, and then the fire of the Lord fell, and precious times. And then we could say Elijah on his knees, I could use that phrase, whenever he so prayed that there was the sound of abundance of rain. We also looked at Elijah under the broom tree, because he became a broken man in fear, ran away, left his post that God had given him to stand in and to serve in. He left his post, ran away, wished to die. Take away my life, he could say. Sad moment. We've been warning ourselves in the last video, the last study, about the importance of keeping close to God and not stepping out of the will of God, or moving from the place that God may have for us to serve. Elijah under the broom tree. But now, today, we just want to see Elijah, at the cave, because he moves on from the broom tree. We're told how the moment came when the angel of the Lord, in verse 7, came back again to him and touched him in his mercy and grace, lift him up and revive him, and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." So he arose, we're told. Elijah arose in verse 8, and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights, as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. And we're told that there, at Horeb, the mountain of God, there he went into a cave. And we're going to be thinking, our thoughts will be surrounding the cave and Elijah's experience at this particular time. This place, Horeb, was a remarkable place, because we think about Moses, of course, and we think about Horeb, and we think about the burning bush back in Exodus, and it's a place where the law was given as well. Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights communing with God. Elijah goes there. He's depressed and discouraged. He's just been praying that the Lord to take his life. He's still recovering from all of that. And here he's at the cave. Most scholars will link this with the hole in the rock where the Lord hid Moses. Remember, at that time, he was hidden in Exodus 33, verse 21 forward. He was hidden in the hole of the rock as the Lord passed by before him and proclaimed his name. And so they link that Elijah's back in this similar position or situation that Moses was in. So what can we say about Elijah then at the cave? Well, you can see God challenging Elijah at the cave. We'll start there with God challenging Elijah at the cave. Then we're going to see again Elijah coming to Elijah at the cave, God coming to Elijah at the cave, and finally God commissioning Elijah at the cave. He begins by challenging him at the cave. We're told here, he came to the cave, verse 9, and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. And he said, what are you doing here, Elijah? The word of the Lord comes to him at the cave. And the Lord asks him, what are you doing here, Elijah? You know, we could say that this could be a comforting word, perhaps, you know. What are you doing here? God knows where we are. Yes, it could be a comforting word. He knows where we are. We're not out of the Lord's sight. He always sees us wherever we are. We're not out of the reach of his arm, and we're not out of the fact that he can guide us in every situation. He's there. What are you doing here? But we don't take it usually as a comforting word here. It's a challenging word. In fact, it's a stern word here. It's reproachful. Elijah, what are you doing here? You see, we have to be careful about the situation, about the use of the word here. If we go back just to when we meet Elijah, first of all, you know, and he goes in before Ahab, we're told then how the word of the Lord came to him in verse 2 of chapter 17 and told him to go eastward and get away and hide at the brook Cherith. You'll drink from the brook. I've commanded the ravens to feed you there. I'm going to feed you there. And when we go down to verse 8 in the same chapter, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Zidon, and dwell there. Elijah, go to the brook. The ravens will feed you there. And the widow of Zarephath, you're to go there, and the widow will provide for you there. Here, we've got these references there. But now we're told, what are you doing here? A very different position. This is a place that God never sent. If you go back to the earlier part of the chapter, God never sent them away from Jezreel. God never sent them at this time there, but he was out of the will of God. We're going to see that. What are you doing here? So we have to be careful. He should have been back in the land as Israel's leader, as the prophet and leader of the people. But the fact is, you know, Elijah has left his post, and he has left his post without the Lord's bidding. There's always the danger of being out of God's will, of being out of the place that he would have us to be. So important that we're in the place of God's choice, of God's will for us. You see, if you think about Elijah here, for him at this time, he'd run away, but there was still plenty to do. Evil to be put down, people to be built up and guided, those that recently had confessed, you know, the Lord, he is God, he is God. But the prophet, he's not in the battle now, sadly. And God comes near to him in the cave, and God says to him, what are you doing here? You know, I remember when I was the pastor of a church in the city of Belfast in the UK, I remember I used to preach about the importance of being totally committed to the church, and especially when the church met to pray, prayer meeting night, it was important to be there, to be crying to God for his blessing. And sometimes you would maybe say something like, you know, where were you on Thursday night? Maybe you were in the shopping mall. And what if the Lord was just to say to you, what are you doing here in this shopping mall when God's people are crying to God for blessing? When God's people are met to pray, maybe you're visiting friends, or you're just have a rest at home, and God could come and say, what are you doing here when you ought to be there? I want to share with you, just many years ago when I was a young Christian, and it never left me, I remembered it until now. The experience of a man who was an old man and who had done a great work for God, actually, in this village with a little fellowship of his people, and he had been there from the beginning and had watched it grow almost around him, and was still developing, and there was blessing. But I remember him saying to me, he said, this is not where I should have been when I was a young man. When I was a young man, the Lord called me to go to the London City Mission, and I didn't go. So what he had done, actually, this work that he had done was like you say, second best with God. And we don't want to be doing something that's second best. We want to do what God really wants us to do, what his first initial plan for us is. So important that we don't get out of the will of God. You take the story of Alan Redpath, who died in 1989, born in 2000 and 1907. He was an author and pastor, wonderfully known and throughout the UK and in the USA. Served in Moody Church in Chicago and Charlotte Chapel in Edinburgh. But writing in one of his books, he revealed that he'd received the call of God to go to China. And he ended up in the UK and in the USA. You need to ask yourself, just to stop in your life and ask yourself, have I missed out on God's best? Or have I made myself really available to him for whatever his will is for me? And so the question comes to Elijah here. What are you doing here, Elijah? He'd forsaken his place and what God had called him to do. No, we need to stop and ask ourselves, am I where I should be? Where God has called me to? Where my business lies and where I can be useful? Is this where God would have me to be? And so Elijah here, the challenge comes to him. The Lord challenges him at the cave and he says, what are you doing here? The fact is that he really, you could say almost that he makes an excuse here. He avoids answering that question as such. He doesn't give the answer. If he confessed to his failure with shame and sorrow, wouldn't it have been wonderful? No doubt that God would have forgiven him and restored him again, and the past would never have been mentioned to him against him, and the results of his flight would have been repaired, and God would have sent him back and used him again wonderfully. But the fact is, he has actually evaded the question and has tried to explain it away. So important that we don't allow ourselves to be misdirected by our own ingenuity, our own decisions out of the will of God. So we have God challenging Elijah at the cave. What are you doing here? F.B. Mayer has written a book on Elijah, which is very precious, and I'm sure I've used parts of it in my own study as I've shared it with you. He wrote these words and he said, life is a time for doing. The world is a great workshop in which there are no room for drones. God himself works as the great master builder. There's plenty to do. Evil to be put down, good to build up, doubters to be directed, prodigals to be won back, sinners to be sought. Up, Christians, leave your caves and do. Do not do in order to be saved, he says. Do not do in order to be saved, but being saved, do. And so Elijah challenged here, what are you doing here? Out of the will of God. So sad in this situation. So you've got God challenging Elijah at the cave, and the answer is not what we would expect. And then there's God coming to Elijah at the cave. Well, God said to him, we're told in verse 11 and 12, go out, stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. He stands at the entrance to the cave, and there's this rushing mighty wind like a violent tornado. Nothing could stand before it. Rips up everything that's in its path. But we're told here, the Lord was not in the wind. And then the earthquake, the ground heaves and splits, but again, the Lord was not in the earthquake. And finally, the fire from heaven. The heaven becomes a blaze of light. The valley is like a smelting pot. But the Lord was not in the fire. All appropriate symbols and times used for the divine presence, but not here. Here there's a still small voice. The Hebrew literally means a voice of gentle silence or of gentle quietness, a still small voice. You know, F.B. Mayer interprets this in this way, where he says that Elijah had been eager for the people to be restored by some mighty act, you know, like the fire that fell at Carmel, or the idols and temples swept away. But that was not God's chosen way of saving Israel, F.B. Mayer said. And because he did not go on working thus, Elijah thought he was not working at all. God was not working at all. And so he abandoned himself to the depths of despondency. But here God reveals that he is still at work, gently, softly, imperceptibly. He's still at work. He affirms further down that he will leave 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. God was still working. You know, here Matthew Henry explains how Elijah, he hid his face then here. It says he hid his face as he stood outside, and really in token of shame that he'd been a coward and fled from his duty. He hid his face, and the Lord speaks to him again. Here's what it says here. We're told, just read this verse again, and verse 13. And so it was, when Elijah heard that, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance to the cave. And suddenly a voice came to him again there, standing outside the cave. And what did the voice say? What are you doing here, Elijah? God challenges him again for the second time. You'd have expected a different answer, but the answer here is the same. He just repeats what he's already said about he's been zealous, they've forsaken, the children have forsaken your covenants, they've killed your prophets, I'm left alone, they're seeking to kill me. That's all he could say. And so we have now the next thing we should notice, not just God challenging him at the cave and coming to Elijah at the cave, but here commissioning Elijah at the cave. Elijah speaks, or God speaks to Elijah, and here's what the Lord says to him. Go return on the way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. Also you shall anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah, you shall anoint as prophet in your place. And it shall be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill. Whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill. Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. Now, Think about this. Especially don't miss where the Lord said to Elisha, the son of Shaphat, you shall appoint as prophet in your place. You know, God has recognized that Elijah will not be able to bear the same burden that he bore before. He can't be assigned the same influential role that he had as he stood on Mount Carmel and challenged the prophets of Baal. It's not for him now to be this deliverer of God's people from Baal as in the past. Others are mentioned here who are going to be taken up in the purpose of God to fulfill the work of God, what God is doing along with Elijah. He's not alone now. Others are taken up, 3 individuals taken up in various ways as he's recalled to service. Hazael, he'll be the rod of divine vengeance upon Israel. He's the one who's going to do that. We've got that in 2 Kings 8 and 2 Kings 10 and 12, those chapters. Jehu would be the scourge for the house of Ahab. And Elisha would be the prophet or the mouthpiece for God instead of Elijah. So it's so important to see that this is the moment when Elijah is set aside, as it were, to some extent. He's sidelined is a word we could use. And others are needed to fulfill the purposes of God as it relates to his people at that time. Sometimes servants of God are given in grace a second chance to accomplish what was God's original or intended plan for them. Sometimes God can give them a second chance, but sometimes others have to be assigned a role. You remember Peter? Well, Peter got a second chance. Remember Peter, we were talking about him in earlier videos, how he denied the Lord before a little maid, just before the maid. But although he went out and wept bitterly in Mark 16 and 7, when Jesus rose from the dead, the angel spoke to those at the tomb, and the angel could say, go tell his disciples. But there's something added there in Mark 16 and 7. Go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you into Galilee, and there you will see him. Peter, don't leave out Peter. And in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, Peter's recommissioned. He's challenged about his love and recognizes that he's fond of the Lord, and he comes down to that level when he's speaking only of his love. And the Lord is demonstrating there that he has come to a different understanding of what he can accomplish himself. Peter needs to depend on the Lord. And he's recommissioned and told to feed his sheep, the Lord's sheep, and feed his lambs. And the Lord took him again, gave him a second chance, and he went on to become the leader in the early church. You can see that in the Acts of the Apostles. Even in chapter 1, when he stands up in the midst of the 120 that are gathered there, he stands up. He's the leader and comes out in look, the Acts of the Apostles very clearly, a second chance. Sometimes you think if Moses was given a second chance, he tried to deliver Israel. Remember, he slew the Egyptian but had to flee. But 40 years later, God speaks to him again, appears to him again at the burning bush, and he's appointed, given the role, along with Aaron, of course, to lead the people out. He's given a second opportunity. Sadly, he did fail again and was not allowed to enter Canaan. As we know, he did not enter Canaan with them. But he was given a second opportunity. King Saul is an example of someone who was rejected, stood head and shoulders above any man in Israel. But the king was given the opportunity but failed, and David was given his place. he was chosen. And here, sad to say, it appears that Elijah misses the opportunity to do through him, for God to do through him what he had intended to do with him, because others have a role to play now in the unfolding plans of God for the people of Israel. It's a very solemn matter, this, really, to know that you can miss the will of God for you, what God intends for you to do in your life. You can miss that. We're told, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 27, that you can become a castaway, or that's the word in the King James. The New King James has disqualified. You could be disqualified. Paul says in that verse, I discipline my body, I bring it into subjection, lest when I've preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. I could lose out and God wouldn't be able to use me as he could have used me. And in one sense, is not that what has happened here to Elijah? In his responses, God has to give him a different service for the future from this moment. We're told in John 15, verse 2 to 4, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. We can become unfruitful. We can lose our opportunity to be a blessing to others in our service for God. We're not talking here about losing your salvation. With the Lord's promise, John 10:28, I give unto my sheep eternal life, they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. My Father who gave them me is greater than all, and no one can pluck them out of my Father's hands. And if you even go to John 6:37, the one that comes to me, I will in no wise cast out. We're not cast away as children. That's what we should take from that verse. We're not cast away as children, but we can be cast away as servants, and we can miss our usefulness and what God was going to do through us. And is this not an example of it here when we think of Elijah? God will employ us, as the older commentators have written, in a less noble ministry. We can still do something, but what there could have been, what things there could have been. Remember those words that were often said, that the world is yet to see what God can do with a person who gives themselves entirely to him. But friends, how have we gone forward in our lives from day to day? How have we served God? Have there been times when we've gone out of the way, when we've taken a wrong step, we've missed out with God, so that he hasn't been able to do through us all that he intended to do? And it appears to be that is the situation with Elijah. One false step, beware for one false step, one act of disobedience, one period of coldness of heart, maybe one outburst of passion, one wrong word even, and the ministry opportunity can be lost, can be missed, and missed forever. What we need to do today is we need to get alone with God now and ask him again, Lord, oh God, whatever's happened in the past, as you look back down through perhaps years of ministry, and there's been times when we've missed to be what God would have us to be. Whatever's happened in the past, we can get into the presence of the Lord and say, Lord, whatever you want me to do from this point on, I want you to do it through me. I don't want to miss out on your will. Whatever you've planned to do, Lord, let me do it. Let me be used by you to the fullest extent until the moment comes when you call me home, or when you come and I'm called to be with you at your second coming. Oh, dear friends, get alone with God and tell him you don't want to miss out on what he's planned for you. That's so important. And so God commissions Elijah again. He still have a role. He'll still be used. But others are going to fill the gap. He'll not be the instrument that he could have been. Others will minister, some doing work that Elijah could have been used for. F.B. Mayer has written these words: it may be that God, by these lines, will speak to some backslider. He'll speak to the backslider saying, go return to me from whom you've wandered. Return to my work, which you've deserted. Return to the posture of faith from which you've fallen. Return to that happy, holy childlikeness of former years. Return, ye backsliding children, and I will heal your backslidings. And you know, the Lord can do that. He can heal and forgive. He can take you again. Give yourself to him again. Place yourself in his hands. Let him do with you whatever he wills, whatever he wants to do through you. And so Elijah goes back, and we're told he goes to Elisha, and we see him receiving God's call here. So Elijah departed from there. He found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he was with the 12th. Then Elijah passed by him and threw his mantle on him. This was like the investiture of a prophet. It was the sense of him being called to serve God in a way he was not doing up to that moment. You know, Elisha was the son of a rich farmer, a young man, but now he's been called to a higher service. You know, the future of the church, you need to remember this, the future of the church depends upon its young men, young women. So important that when we're young, we take seriously the Lord's plan for our lives, his will for our lives, the Lord's call. We can flitter our lives away and waste them on things that are of no value. We ask ourselves, as a young man, God could be calling you to some ministry for the future. Don't miss out on the call of God. We need dedicated young people who are ready to serve. And so Elisha makes a commitment here. He left the oxen. He ran after Elijah. He does ask to go back to see his parents before he departs. You know, that wasn't an excuse for delay now. He was just being respect, I would suggest myself, respect, just the duty he owed to his father and his mother. And Elijah did tell him to go back and do that, and then to come when he was ready to come. And so it happened. He would not force him, you know, and that's quite true. The Lord does not force us into his service. And we must be ready, of course, when the call comes, to put everything before the Lord, before everything. You take those verses in Matthew 10:37. Jesus says, who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son and daughter more than me is not worthy of me. The Lord must be first. And he was first here as far as Elisha was concerned. In fact, here we're told about how he burnt the yoke, and he's burning his bridges there. He's leaving that ministry behind, and he slays the animals. He feeds the people, the people with them. It's almost as if he has a real heart for the people, and he provides for them before he leaves. The fact is this: he has chosen Elisha to be the servant of a prophet rather than the master of a large farm. He has made his choice. Sometimes we have to make choices like that, and many of us in our past lives sacrificed all to follow the Lord. Precious, a life of service. There's nothing like it, and I can testify to that even today. But oh dear friends, let's not leave Elijah. Let's remember the wrong step he took, and the fact that he could not no longer be fulfilling the ministry, the real plan that God had formed. Don't miss out on God's best. Give yourself entirely to Him again for the rest of your life until He comes. May the Lord bless you. Amen.